Brought to you by Penguin Random House Canada.
A History of Women in 101 Objects, A Walk Through Female History. Written by Annabelle Hirsch and translated by Eleanor Updegraff. Read for you by a full cast.
A History of Women in 101 Objects was written by Annabelle Hirsch and translated by Eleanor Updegraff. This audiobook is the first of its kind, a major collaboration collecting the voices of 101 remarkable women from all over the world to speak life into this vital and important history. Contributors come from many different walks of life, from writers and artists to chefs, political leaders, activists, actors, thinkers and makers. They represent the singular power of womanhood in the 21st century, and we at Canongate Books want to publicly thank each and every one of these readers for generously giving of their time and talent to this wildly ambitious project. This audiobook was created by Canongate in collaboration with Refuge, England's largest charity for women and their children, which is working to end domestic abuse and empower women to live without violence and fear. Since 1971, Refuge has led the campaign against domestic abuse in England and become the country's largest single provider of specialist domestic and gender-based violence services, offering support to thousands of women and their children on any given day. By purchasing this book, you are supporting Refuge's vital mission against domestic abuse. If you or someone you know needs immediate help, please contact the Refuge-run National Domestic Abuse Helpline on 0808 2000 247. Further information and options for donation can be found at refuge.org.uk.
Introduction. A couple of years ago, on a trip to the Danish coast, I visited the childhood home of the novelist Karen Blixen. To my own astonishment, I realized that I wasn't so much fascinated by the place itself, the desk where she wrote, her paintings adorning the walls, but by what seemed an insignificant detail, a number of copper pans stacked up in the corner of the kitchen. I found myself trying to imagine that small, slender woman pottering around with them, how she might have felt, what she might have been thinking about. Did she even cook? Were those her pots, or had they belonged to her stuff? What, I asked myself, did her kitchen utensils say about the author of Babette's Feast? Did they even say anything about her everyday life, her existence as a woman, as a Danish woman, a European woman of that era? Pans and other such objects are the very opposite of monuments. They don't commemorate revolutions or victories on the battlefield, don't allude to great contracts or those moments of upheaval that have an undeniably transformative effect on society. It's rarely possible to link them to one specific date, to say, from that day on, everything was different. They don't belong to the so-called big picture of history, but instead to a realm that is far more intimate, quiet and overlooked, a realm that was long considered female and accordingly insignificant. I hadn't long embarked on my research for this book when I had an interesting experience. At a dinner party one evening, I started telling the table about the new project I had in mind: to narrate the history of women through objects. What would that look like? One of the women there asked curiously. What sorts of objects, for example? Before I could answer her question, before I'd even had a chance to explain that they would be objects which told the stories of women's everyday lives, of big moments and small ones. Objects linked to topics that have a bearing on women, the body, sex, love, work, art, politics. Objects that bear witness to the movements women instigated and to all the myths to which they've been forced to conform since time immemorial. That say something about how they dealt with that, how they fought, how they freed themselves, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly. How they always found, or at least tried to find, a way to be themselves. That some of those objects would, of course, make reference to a particular woman and the influence she had, but not all of them. Because this wasn't going to be a book about the 100 coolest women in history, but a cabinet of curiosities showing how rich and diverse, how complex and non-linear the history of all women is. No, before I could say any of that, an elderly gent brayed loudly. Women and objects, but women are objects. A stupid line, crude and not at all funny. But underneath, it does hint at something. At the fact that history has so often been narrated as though this comment were true. As though, for most of it, women really did have about as little influence or significance as a vase you'd put on display in the corner, or, occasionally, fill with something, a baby. Even today, with inspirational women and their stories being pulled out of oblivion, it can sometimes sound as though active thinking, fighting, storytelling, tightrope walking women are something quite new. As though, with a couple of notable exceptions, all those who came before us were asleep, mere onlookers. As though their story is largely one of passive victims. None of that is true. None of that has ever been true. At least not in the way we usually tell it. Women have always been there and they have always contributed. The objects for which they were so often mistaken and with which they shared the domains, the personal and the public too, bear witness to this side of history that has so long been overlooked, so often ignored or dismissed as insignificant, irrelevant, trivial. These objects don't reference drum-beating, big-picture history, at least not always, but point instead to details and anecdotes, to things that only gained in importance over time and with great perseverance. They narrate the world in a different way. Some can be set within a larger context, some played a role at a very specific moment, some speak to a wider tendency, still others of one particular woman whose story I didn't want to omit. Because this collection of objects is absolutely subjective. It wasn't curated by a historian, but by a woman who grew up between France and Germany at the end of the 20th century. A woman who loves women, their objects and their stories. A collection chosen by a woman who has a penchant for the unimportant and anecdotal, and who enjoys taking imaginary walks through the distant past. The focus here is on the history of women of the Western Hemisphere, not out of any lack of interest in the rest of the world, but, on the contrary, because it would have seemed to me dishonest to extend this intuitive, subjective approach to cultures with which I am unfamiliar such that I could not do them justice. A history of women in 101 objects extends through the past like a long hallway along which, here and there, I open a door or pull something down off a shelf, to shed light on certain aspects of history or tell a particular story. There are 101 objects here, but there could just as well have been 200, 300, 1,000. It was hard to place a limit. Because the history of women and their objects is unbelievably rich, so much richer than you might think. It is manifold and sometimes sad, often insanely amusing. Sometimes it makes you want to shout for joy to see how strong and resourceful and wily women have always been, how close even our most distant relatives are to us, how similar our thoughts, concerns and ambitions despite all that separates us. This history of women is neither exhaustive nor definitive, but nor does it want to be. Above all, it hopes to inspire you to dig deeper, to get things down from the shelves of history, to look for details and anecdotes and all those supposedly irrelevant matters, and to find in them material links to a world still far too unknown to us, the world that belongs to the women of history. Annabelle Hirsch.
Healed Thema, circa 30,000 BC, read for you by Gillian Anderson. Several decades have now passed since American anthropologist Margaret Mead gave a university lecture during which she was asked to name the object that, in her opinion, could be regarded as the first sign of human civilization. The student asking this question Probably expected her to start talking about a clay pot, or...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?